So good day, everyone. Mary Hunt here at the Water Office. Delighted to welcome you to our March Water Talk. Kate Common will be talking with us about her new book, Undoing Conquest, Ancient Israel, the Bible, and the Future of Christianity. And this comes from Orbis Books. And we're delighted to have you with us, Kate. And I am accompanied by my colleagues here at Water, Diane New, who is the other co-director, and our staff colleagues, Pamela Miller, who's a Master of Divinity student at Wesley Theological Seminary, doing her practicum here at Water, and also Lisa Lautenbach from Nuremberg, Germany, who's with us this year as part of the Church of the Brethren volunteer program and with the German group Irene. It's a delight to have Kate with us to talk about the book, and let us begin with a land acknowledgement before we get into the heart of the matter here. This is something that we at Water have incorporated into our programs to remind ourselves of why we do what we do and what we need to do more of, given the systemic injustice against Indigenous and other people of color in this country. A land acknowledgement, as you know, is a beginning, not an end, a time to reflect on our history and to commit to justice making. We at Water are on the indigenous land in Silver Spring, Maryland, that is the traditional and contemporary land of the Piscataway and Anacostan peoples. We acknowledge the trauma and the injustice toward indigenous people that is deep in U.S. culture and history. We join in efforts to eradicate it and to make reparations for the genocide involved. Water's work, whether intellectual, spiritual, or liturgical, is aimed to bring about social justice, using the resources of feminist studies in religion. So if you will, with me, take a quiet moment to consider the Native people on whose land you sit. Feel free to put their names in the chat if you wish, and let this be a time to deepen your commitment to undo that injustice. Thank you. Water's work brings feminist and womanist spiritual values and intellectual work to efforts at social change. Our hope is that by sharing this work in this setting, we're socializing the resources of feminist womanist work in religion and thus spreading tools and energy for justice. Today's format is simple. We will have an introduction that I will give of the speaker, Kate Common, and then Kate will have 20 to 25 minutes to introduce her new book, Undoing Conquest, and there'll be plenty of time after that for dialogue, for questions and discussion. I invite you to listen and enjoy. Please mute your Zoom audio so that we do not get any feedback or any noise from your dog or your child who's hungry or whatever may be happening in your situation. And then we'll have a good, clear line for the presentation. We are recording, as we always do, and this will be available on our website at www.waterwomensalliance.org in a couple of days. The video will be up, and then the notes that we take will be available. And Kate, if you want to contribute notes that you are using, we are happy to share those as well. We will end at the top of the hour, which is 2 o'clock here in the afternoon on the East Coast of the US. For those in other countries, do the math, but you can be sure that we'll finish at the top of the hour. And then you can re-listen to this or point other people in the direction of this teleconference or use it for your own teaching or study on the website later on. We'll keep the line open for those who wish to continue the conversation a bit after 2 o'clock. Kate says she's going to be available a little bit to continue if we do not finish our conversation by 2. But the official session will end, and you can leave gracefully at that point. You can leave anytime you want, but you can leave gracefully at that point without feeling that you've missed anything. And I think that the ongoing conversation, if it's the sort of thing that has a lot of content to it, we will also share, but at least you've gotten the heart of it now, between now and 2 o'clock. Let me introduce Kate. Professor Kate Common is welcome at Water. This, I think, is your first Water experience of giving a talk. She has an undergraduate degree in fine arts from Kent State University and an MA from Andover Newton Theological Seminary. In 2021, Kate completed the PhD at Boston University School of Theology. I met Kate during their studies when she co-produced a wonderful film entitled Forging Voices, which came out in 2017. She interviewed womanist and feminist theologians about gender, race, and theology. Well, this would all seem to be a quite typical profile of a feminist queer theologian, but in fact, Kate has an equally impressive background in design, both in design theory and in design itself. She worked for Marshall's, a top Fortune 100 design team. I think you know their ads in your newspapers. Design and theology come into happy collaboration in her hands, as will be evident as she gives us an overview of her new book, Undoing Conquest, published this year by Orbis. Kate, who uses she and they pronouns, is currently assistant professor of public and practical theology at the Methodist Theological School in Ohio, sometimes referred to as Methesco, where they teach courses on the intersection of feminist and queer theology, ecclesiology, biblical studies, design thinking, and leadership. They're working on their second book, Desiring Utopia, Queering Church, in conjunction with the AAR, American Academy of Religion, series in Oxford University Press. This is how Kate describes Undoing Conquest. This book examines problematic Christian theologies and the biblical conquest narrative in the book of Joshua that undergirds white settler Christian colonialism and genocide across the globe, and specifically in the North American context. The book explores how archaeological evidence across Israel and Palestine challenges the violent conquest story in the Bible and can reshape Christian identity and faith practice. The book speaks to this critical moment when the Israel-Gaza war rages on and many churches seek to deal with violent Christian pasts. She goes on to say, Undoing Conquest interprets archaeological research from a feminist and decolonial perspective and designs a new liturgical season called a Season of Origins that integrates archaeological histories and centers justice work at the heart of the church's annual rhythms. This book, she concludes, gives people a tangible place to start repairing violent Christian histories. In my blurb on the back of the book, I wrote in part, Kate Common's book arrives at a propitious moment when an intractable conflict with scriptural roots cries out for new thinking. This is feminist practical theology at its best, and God willing, just in the nick of time. It's my pleasure to welcome you, Kate, at what I hope will be the first of many collaborations with Water. Congratulations on the book and also on your tenure track job at Methesco. The floor is now yours. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, Mary. Thank you, Water, for having me. I'm very excited to be here. And I just want to say before I get into the book that I never expected to write a book on the Bible and archaeology. You heard a little bit about my past, and I was in the corporate world for about 10 years before switching into a master's in a master's of divinity at that time, thinking I was going to go to seminary to become a UCC minister and help make the church more progressive and welcoming to queer folks. So it was very unexpected when I sat in an introduction to Hebrew Bible class, and I came from a very conservative background, both Catholic and evangelical, that had a very high regard for the Bible and biblical histories, and really took the Israelite history seriously in the ways that we understood our faith. And so there I am, first semester, trying to take it all in. And I remember the Hebrew Bible professor saying, sort of in passing, archaeology over the last 100 years has turned up a new origin story of the Hebrew people that pretty much contradicts the conquest narrative. And moving on, the Assyrian Empire was really wreaking havoc at that time. And I was kind of like, what? It was like a record screeching. And I'm like, what did I just hear? A new origin story? Like, why have I not heard this before? And why are we just sort of, we didn't even have a lecture on it, just skipped over. And it was really that moment that marks this fascination, deep dive into this history. It really grabbed hold of me that day, and it hasn't let go. That was in 2008. So this book has really been over 10 years in the making. And part of that has been, if anyone is familiar with sort of academic theology and the ways the disciplines are set up, that means like, what are you going to specialize in when you get into a PhD program? Pretty typically, biblical studies is over here and theology is over here, and very little sort of joint work is done between those two fields. And so this book is actually one example of this type of work happening where theology and biblical studies, and in this case, archaeology, I've brought them together, and not on my own, with a lot of help at Boston University with biblical scholars there. Dr. Kathy Darr, Dr. Brandon Simonson have all worked with me from that discipline to really do justice and work to bring this narrative to life, ultimately for the church. And so I return full circle that my reason for being hasn't changed. I still truly want to create a more just church for queer folks, for women, for everyone. And so it's just that my methods and my vision for that has changed significantly. So no more UCC ministry for me. Instead, I find myself a professor of public and practical theology. So that's just a little bit of brief segue into why the book. How did I get here? So I want to invite us into the book itself. I'm not going to assume that many of you know what this archaeology is that I'm talking about. And so let's spend about the next 20 minutes or so just sort of getting familiar with the content of Undoing Conquest. And so part one, I really want to think about this conquest story and violence in the Bible. And Undoing Conquest, as the title alludes, really focuses on violence in the Bible, particularly what is known as the conquest narrative found in the book of Joshua. Why this story? Well, it has a long history of justifying violence in the real world, especially from Christian imperialist perspectives. And it's still doing so today. It has been called by some a text of terror. The conquest story, as I said, still influences today. In fact, this is an image from the January 6th insurrection in which a group took part called the Jericho March. And this group symbolically enacted the conquest narrative in the book of Joshua and literally marched around certain government buildings as a means to try to take back the country from what they understood as a stolen election. So you hear them sort of blowing the shofars, which is directly out of reference in terms of thinking about Joshua and the Jericho story in particular. The walls sort of came tumbling down. And so before we get too far along, I want to just bring us all up to speed on what I'm talking about the book of Joshua or the conquest narrative, because I don't want to assume everyone knows that. So we're talking about the book of Joshua, the 6th book in the Bible. It comes right after the Exodus story. So imagine that the Israelites have been a miraculous escape from Egypt, and they have been wandering in the wilderness for about 40 years before God brings them to the edge of the Jordan River, looking out upon the ancient land of Canaan, which is currently what we would understand Israel and Palestine. And essentially in the story, Joshua 3, chapters 3 through 9 in particular, God calls the Israelites to conquer this land. That means to take the land, to kill all the inhabitants. And that means here in the Bible, specifically women, men, children, and livestock. And so everybody in the land was supposed to be given to God in a holy sacrifice. And then the land was to be given to the Israelites. And this is one of the major battles in this story. It says that God's armies of Israelites sort of marched around Jericho 7 times and then blew the shofars and the walls came tumbling down. And so this story has had a long life beyond the Bible and beyond the original context of people that wrote that Bible. In the hands of Christian empires, this story became really sort of a new script that Christians could read themselves into. And so Christians saw themselves as the Israelites, and they saw sort of any land or people that they wanted to take as a land of Canaan. And so you see this most prominently in North America, and you can find ample evidence that sort of a puritanical mindset, a European imperialist Christian mindset, really saw America as the new promised land. And the indigenous peoples here were cast in the story as Canaanites. And so here, this story enabled Christians to murder, displace, acts of genocide, just horrific beyond imagine, with sort of impunity, without guilt, to be like, we're just doing what God called us to do. And so this story lives on through ideas of like manifest destiny, this idea that the West is just open for people to take, that these lands are sort of empty, or that if there are people there, we can just do as we please. And so you see this story all throughout American history and still in our current sort of social imagination. Again, you see this in current day events, as I said, with January 6th. And you see this story showing up in the current Israel and Gaza war. And so there's a long history of thinking about this story in Israel and Palestine. And in November 2023, Benjamin Netanyahu said in a speech, "You must remember what Amalek has done to you," says our Holy Bible. And commentators have said that what Netanyahu does is compares Hamas to the nation of Amalek in this passage from the Bible. And this passage, in its context, says to smite all the Amalekites after the nation launched a surprise attack on the Jewish people. And so here he's leveraging sort of this conquest narrative of a biblical commandment to destroy all of Amalek, completely destroy, killing each and every person, including babies, property, animals, everything. And so this story just continues to echo. And we're seeing that echo this time with real images coming out of Gaza. And so it's just horrific. But other things are happening too. And there are churches that are beginning to realize and take responsibility for the long histories of Christian colonialism and conquest. And so this is an image of Pope Francis in July 2022. He did a papal tour to Canada, where he sought out reconciliation for the Catholic Church's atrocities surrounding the Indigenous boarding schools. Now, the Pope's visit was received with some ambivalence. However, lots of people, including Indigenous folks, said that they appreciated the start of the conversation, even though it's nowhere near finished. But it's a prominent example here in the Catholic Church where folks are realizing we've got to look at these long histories. Like it's not as if history has stayed in the past. It's very much present in the ways in which power and colonialism still operate. More locally, the Episcopal Diocese in Massachusetts, where I'm from, has just created a toolkit for reparations in community and a reparations fund of with a goal of $11 million to begin process of reparations, land back, and a deep dive into what local dioceses and parishes, their responsibility for land taking and other colonialism and other atrocities. And so that's sort of the conquest now and how it plays a part. But now let's take a turn to archaeology in the Bible. So on one hand, you have the conquest narrative explaining how the Israelites ended up in the land of Canaan, or Israel and Palestine today. But as I've alluded, archaeology paints a very different picture. And so let's get into that, but let's first orient ourselves geographically. So this is a map of the ancient Near East, and the location we're interested is in this map, Pa Kanana, and that is ancient Canaan. Now, the time period we're looking at is around 1200 BCE. So if you get sort of a linear timeline in your mind, we're talking 1200 years before the supposed birth of Christ. So a lot of time before that period. And so during this time, Egypt is really controlling much of this region that's circled in blue. And it was controlling through a series of city-states where the kings would pay tribute to Pharaoh in response for getting supplies that were needed and sort of military support if they needed it. And Egypt controlled this region for about 300 years until the end of the Bronze Age, again, 1200 BCE. Something started to happen that was first a mystery, and it's that the Egyptian empire began to collapse. And not only the Egyptian empire, but a lot of the other empires and civilization around that area. And so this was a really chaotic time of destruction and power shifts. And it's right in this moment that archaeology starts to reveal something. And what archaeologists revealed was that it was a new sort of hidden history that had been literally buried over for millennia. And it's not a Dan Brown novel, but it has sort of that edge to it. And I think that's what first caught my ear in the Hebrew introduction to Hebrew Bible. That, like, wow, there's actually a hidden history, and it's not a Dan Brown novel. Like, why aren't we talking about this? And so what actually was discovered? And essentially, archaeologists working across the West Bank and Israel started to unearth small villages and discovered that there was a diverse network of agricultural and pastoral villages made up of groups of farmhouses built together in sort of a circular pattern, was cropping up everywhere in the midst of this collapse. What they found was that these farmhouses were largely unfortified. They did not have weapons, and they were just out of the reach of empire. And they were out of the reach not because they were far away. They were actually geographically really close, but they were in the highland regions. And so the highland regions, this is a topographic map of current day Israel and Palestine. And these villages were scattered all about, which is in this rocky, hilly terrain. And whereas Egypt maintained control of this lower area along the Mediterranean. Well, they were out of the reach of empire because of a pretty basic thing. Egypt had horses and chariots as part of its military infrastructure, and they literally couldn't get up into the rocky hillsides. And so these folks, I guess you could say it was a stroke of luck, the Egyptians that still controlled the area as they started to crop up just couldn't get up there to them. And so they had sort of relative independence for roughly about 150 years. And so the basic premise here is that archaeology contradicts conquest. And how does it do that? Well, as I said, these folks were not a warring people. There is no evidence of conquest anywhere. There's no evidence of sort of a warring group that went in and destroyed the land of Canaan and all of its inhabitants. Rather, what you see are hundreds of villages that were peaceful from what anyone can tell, in the sense that there's no weapons, they're not readying themselves for war, that they're dealing with a unique change. And this big change is climate change. And so in the last 10 years, this is new information, essentially archaeobotanists drilled sediment cores from the bottom of the Sea of Galilee and discovered that around 1200 BCE, that sweet spot that we've been talking about, a large global, or I don't know if it was global, but regional climate change happened. There were several ice sheets that melted off of Greenland. This caused a weather pattern change throughout the Mediterranean and caused extreme drought in the region. And this climate change lasted for over 150 years. And during that time, the Egyptian empire collapsed. People from all over the Mediterranean started moving, started migrating, looking for better lands. More and more sort of threats came. And so here, if you're interested in the biblical text, you hear about the Philistines coming, or the sea people. These folks came and challenged the Egyptian empire. And for the first time, they were actually a group of folks that could get up into this rocky highlands region. And so a threat starts to happen to these groups of folks. But this wasn't until about 150 years later. So in response to the climate change, it appears that folks moved into these sort of dry areas to escape empire, but they were able to do so by leveraging new technologies. Here you see one of these technologies, which is terraced agriculture. And so they were able to backfill land and create basically farmable land when there wasn't farmable land before. They also utilized cistern wells to preserve water all year around and deal with the drought. And so They were also able to utilize tools, ironworking tools, which was, again, a new invention during this time period, that enabled folks sort of living off the grid to have access to iron, which before that, in the Bronze Age, metal was really only limited to sort of a palace aristocracy because it was a very expensive metal to deal with. And so in these Highland settlements, as they're known, scholars argue that there at the during this cultural development was sort of a justice-oriented living practice, and that they were not hierarchical, such as sort of the imperial places that they left, but they were egalitarian-ish or even hierarchical, and that they did not have a ruling class. Power was shared amongst people, including across genders. And so it's radically different than what was happening in the city-states below. And so it is here that biblical scholars and archaeologists mark the origins of what they're calling the Proto-Israelite or the Hebrew people. That through this new cultural development, you have the invention of the Hebrew alphabet, you have the beginning to the development of a new ethnic and cultural identity, which will later form to be known as Israel. This is before the written biblical texts, but this group very much influenced as the biblical texts and the Israelite tradition and religion would begin to form. And so this is a really critical story. And I asked myself, why has this story not shaped our faith? When I started researching this in 2008, there was no real intersection between this new story that sort of predates but yet feeds into the biblical faith traditions at all. There was some work done in biblical studies, and very often, sometimes that biblical studies book known as the Tribes of Yahweh, which was a really important text that first sort of brought this out. Folks will get their hands on it in church settings or even base communities in Latin America, some justice groups in South Africa, and they would see that this story had real impact and import for the justice work they were doing in relation to the church. But yet there hasn't really been a concerted effort to create this narrative in a way that churches can use and start to think about in terms of shaping their own identity. And so that's really the work of the book. And so the Highland settlements and faith practice in terms of thinking about how can a story like this shape us? And this is really where my commitments to feminist and queer methodologies come into play. And there's a long line of history in the sense within feminist and queer studies that tell us that stories shape us. And not just stories, but origin stories. How do we understand our history? Where did we come from? Who are we? And that there's a real need to imagine our identities, reimagine our histories from more liberative ways so that we can reshape our present and therefore create a new future. And so liberative stories really can challenge the status quo. And so I interpret this archaeological evidence as a liberating sort of counter memory or counter history to the conquest story. That rather than the origins of the biblical traditions be sort of coming out of the story of conquest, violence, genocide, just taking over of land, that rather you see sort of a collective liberative movement of folks dealing with issues of climate change, empire, socioeconomic injustice, leveraging new technologies to create more just ways of life. Like that's a really powerful story. And how can we allow it to begin to shape us, to begin to reimagine the Christian tradition? And so my work has been to invite this Highland settlement story to shape our faith practices, but not necessarily an easy thing to do in the sense that, like, how do we integrate Iron Age archaeology into our current praxis? And so that's really the heart of the practical theology piece of and where I really integrate sort of a design thinking practice. Like, how do we integrate this story? And so I land on this sort of invention of what I'm calling the season of origins. And this is a liturgical season that I imagine to be similar to Advent in that it's a 4-week liturgical season that can center justice work. And that each week has a particular theme. The first week being invite. And this is a chance for churches and communities to invite new liberative stories into the life of the church. Here, I'm thinking the Highland settlements, but it wouldn't need to be limited to there. Week 2 would be about naming, sort of doing that historical reparative work, naming the atrocities of the past and taking responsibility for past harms. The 3rd week would be repair, a chance to imagine how can we begin to make reparations or other justice-seeking actions. And week 4 turns to imagine, how can we together imagine a more just way forward? And the significance of a liturgical season is that every year there's sort of a perennial return to these themes, to these stories, and that it embeds this justice work into the heart of the church, which is really critical if we want to deal with the long legacies of white settler colonialism, Christian imperialism, and ultimately seek to undo conquest. So I'll end there. And yeah, a lot of content.
Thank you so very much, Kate, for not only sharing this with us, but also getting a very, what I think is as a provocative book out into the public arena for conversation at a time when we need it. This is Undoing Conquest, Ancient Israel, the Bible, and the Future of Christianity, published by Orbis this year. It's clearly a book that opens new doors for social and ecclesial change. With the Highland settlement material being increasingly well known, this is a new resource in the public arena for leaving aside conquest language and imagery. That exodus, as it were, to the hills was a positive and creative step according to this new origin story, a step toward a new way of living. Be very interested in hearing what scholars have to say about this, particularly biblical scholars. I appreciate, as a theologian, the clarity of your text, as well as the various ways in which you share the message, biblical and archaeological scholarship, sermon ideas, images, and the texts themselves. So thank you very much. We turn now to our discussion, cognizant of the time limits, but eager to hear from participants. So the floor is open. Please use the raise hands function, which is at the bottom of your screen. I have just raised my hand, and it will also move me to the top of the queue so people can see me and see that I'm ready to roll here. Tell us your name, where you're from, and then please be brief so that we can hear from many people. I realize this is a controversial topic and one that has many people's views. Many people have views that are quite different. So please be respectful of all of those views. And again, be brief so we can hear from lots of people. The official session will end at the top of the hour, which will be 2 here on the East Coast in the US. And those who want to stay on to continue the discussion are welcome to do so. I'm sure that we will not have finished our conversation, but we will have learned, as we already have, a great deal that I hope we can ponder in our various settings and decide how we want to use it in our own work. So let me open the floor. I have a number of questions myself, but I will open it to others. The first people to speak are a combination called Judith and Martha. I believe that would be the newly inducted into the Women's Hall of Fame last night in New York, Judith Plaskow, and her wonderful companion, Martha Ecclesburg. Just to begin with a word of congratulations, and how excited I was to see the pictures already today, and especially the beautiful picture of you and your family. So congratulations. If there will be an event at the American Academy of Religion, we hope to celebrate this terrific accomplishment. So Judith and Martha, go ahead. Unmute, please, and receive our congratulations first.
Thank you so much, Mary, and thank you so much, Kate. I mean, this is a really important book, especially at this moment. I wondered if you could talk to us about where then the conquest narrative comes from, you know, given that it is counterfactual. And actually, one can see that even in the book of Joshua itself, which is totally contradictory. You know, why this story for people who are living very differently?
Excellent question. Great to see you, Judith. Thank you. And I'm just going to share a screen because I've got a slide for that.
Just happen to have.
Yeah. So now here is a slide that really helps us think about this exact question. Why is it that folks over here at the Iron Age, 1200 to 1050 BCE, that were living quite peaceful, how did their story of origin suddenly get told as conquest? Well, to understand that from a biblical studies perspective, we really have to fast forward. And here we're talking a big fast forward of about 500 years. And this is a time period that is well beyond that origin story. We've now had centuries of sort of Israel and Judah, a two kingdom, like a centuries of state building and cultural and text production happening. And the conquest story, a lot of biblical scholars think, was actually originating in this time period, 640 BCE, so almost 500 years later. And why was the story told? A lot of people think, and if you're a Bible nerd, feel free to go to 2 Kings chapter 22, and you'll start to read about King Josiah and a series of cultic reforms and even a lost book that he found. And it is during this time period that if you understand what had just happened prior, the Assyrian Empire had conquered the northern kingdom of Israel, and you had a flood of refugees coming into Jerusalem, sort of the southern kingdom of Judah. Along with the flood of refugees, you also had, for the first time, a flood of money and resources from the Assyrian Empire. For the first time, Jerusalem became an important exporter of olive oil and other luxury goods to the empire. And so a wealthy class began to emerge. And it's from here that scholars start to argue that King Josiah and the people sort of backing him wanted to make a go at becoming a power player in the region. But to do that, they really needed to reshape their tradition to more mimic some of the nationalist and imperial, if you will, ways of being in the world. And so a lot of text writing happened. And essentially what happened is that folks recast their history, including this period, into becoming more of a warring history. So just like, as I'm saying, feminists and other critical theorists are saying, we need to, if we want to have a more just world, we need to reimagine our histories to be more just. The same premise is true here. If we want to create a more sort of nation state imperialistic present, then we need to reimagine our history to be a more warring people. And so that's where scholars think that the conquest narrative emerged, that it was a chance for folks here to recast their history so that they could sound and be a lot more violent and imperialistic and sort of make a go at, rather than just always being sort of beat up and traumatized by empires, to sort of put a stake in the land that we too are a force to be reckoned with. And so that's where this history emerges. And there's a lot more to unpack there, but I'll just leave that there. There's a 500-year difference between the two, and that's a really long time. But yeah, thanks for that, Judith.
Judith, any response to that, or shall we move on? Okay. Carrie Roach would be next. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kate. Your book has turned my life around personally, but I read about this. I have biblical scholarship practices, but what do I do with it? Now I know. I just went to a meeting with the Gulf South New Deal in Appalachia, climate justice, amazing people looking for your work. So I told them all about it in my little small group, just to let you know that I used your name. I told them about your book, and they are meeting in Birmingham in July of 2024 and in Pittsburgh in December 2024. And I ask that you please, I beg you to connect with them, and you have the methodology, the practical theology skills that I understand them to need. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Carrie. And I'll
Uh,
just, I just
yeah,
want
go
to
ahead.
respond briefly, like, wow, thank you, Carrie. I'm glad the book has had impact. And you're pulling on a really important thread, this notion that like we are in this critical time period where we're dealing with the need for climate justice, anti-colonialism. And it's just, to me, it's continued to be remarkable that like here were folks, 1200 years BCE dealing with a climate change, dealing with what do we do with the collapse of empire, dealing with what do we do with socioeconomic injustice. And it just, I think what you're pointing to is that it really speaks to these justice movements in a variety of ways. So thanks for picking up on that. I'd be happy to be in touch after and make that connection.
They don't call us the Women's Alliance for nothing. I want to just turn to Jane Grovajohn's question or comment in the chat. Jane writes, "I'm struck by how destruction precipitated regeneration that introduced different practices of power and community without war and conquest." And I think that's a very insightful comment. Let's go to Veronica Dunn, and then we'll come back to you, Jane. How's that? Veronica Dunn from Western Canada, go ahead.
Yes, thank you. I have a question, Kate. I have about a page of notes from your talk. And in about the third last line, I have what you said about how origin stories shape us. And then you laid out 4 seasons of origins. And I feel like in some ways that's really key to what you're saying, but I'm not sure what to do with that.
Thank you, Veronica. I appreciate that question. This is really sort of where the practical theology and my background in design comes into play, is that how do we actually sort of enact these origin stories? How do we live into them? Or what I think, how do we let them shape us? And that's not going to happen if we don't start to practice with them, to read them, to think about them. So I draw on, in the book, I draw on an example of, from the corporate world, the Coca-Cola company, and how they literally in the 20th century reshaped Christmas, and what we think of around Christmas. What are the classic icons of Christmas? What do we come to expect with the season? Santa and the big red outfit, the polar bears, the Coke, just the whole iconography around Christmas. Before Coke started rolling out this massive campaign in the 1930s, Christmas didn't have such a commercial or unified look and feel. And Santa Claus wasn't as big of a thing. Like, yes, there was Saint Nick and there was Santa Claus, but nowhere near we have it in the cultural imaginary today. And what did Coke do? They spent, billions of dollars over the last 100 years to create a season of Christmas that we are now participating in. And so I kind of take that insight and I say, okay, well, we don't have billions of dollars as the church or as the sort of a progressive church to do that kind of work. But we do have communities of practice. We do have seasons. And what if we started to build this justice work into an annual liturgical practice, an annual work of the people, where we start to really recraft our practices of church around these kind of justice issues, around these origin stories. We tell them, we invite others in, we bring them, we preach on them, we have book groups around it. In my mind, as being a part of a progressive congregation for over 10 years, again, it's anecdotal, but what I saw was that there was always sort of the social justice warriors lined up to do the book talk, to go to the speaker, but it was a limited number of people. It was never the whole congregation invited into it. So from a designer, from a practical theologian, I'm thinking, how can we get the whole group involved, whether they want to be there or not, and start to do these stories together, start to do the reparative work together, and that we do it every year. Because this justice work isn't going away. It's not enough to do one book talk. It's not enough to be like, let's read this together, and then that's it. No, we have to start doing practices annually to invite our congregations into deeper conversation and to allow these stories and traditions to really shape us. So I don't know where it will go, but I think we at least need to provide the container to let the Spirit, from a pneumatological perspective, like speak, shape us. So I hope that answers your question, Veronica. And I try to give ideas in the book to do that, because it can be a tall order and we shouldn't have to do it alone.
Yeah, it's a very practical book in that sense, and practical theology is not is not the frame for it for nothing. I mean, it really is a book meant to do just that, to change the imaginary. Let's go back to Jane Grovichon if you want to say something more, and then we'll go on to Levon.
I just had a question, and it's a difficult question. I appreciate the theology. I'm absolutely in bed with it in every possible way, right? However, we sit as people, at least here in the United States, with tremendous power, and we have economic power, we have military might. What happens when this theology is really implanted amongst the people who've been decimated for generations? Is it a plausible opportunity? Is it a plausible understanding and practice of power and community for a people that are constantly being wiped out? Thank you.
Thanks, Jane. I appreciate that. So one of the nuances that I make in the text is really that these stories and these practices will have to be different based on your I'm thinking here congregations, but sort of your cultural background, where you're at, whether you're on the side of sort of the Christian imperialists or you're on the side of folks that have been destroyed, displaced by power. And so a lot of my research and sort of a hermeneutic of reading the Conquest narrative comes out of Indigenous scholars' work. And I'm thinking here in particular of Robert Woyer, who talks about and makes that connection that Indigenous Native American peoples have been cast as the Canaanites. And that these stories, that the Exodus story that ends with sort of conquest really isn't liberative for people on the other side of power. And so I'm keeping that in mind while also writing from my perspective as sort of progressive mainline Protestant, predominantly white congregations, like how do we do this justice work? I've been in close dialogue with Dr. Teddy Hickman Maynard, dean at the Harvard Divinity School, about this work. And he's talked a lot about how he co-pastors an AME church with his wife, and that they would love to do Season of Origins, but Season of Origins is going to look very different in a Black church. And that they're going to play out these, sort of name, repair, imagine very differently than I would say a predominantly white church across the street. That naming might be naming the stories of folks, that have always been speaking truth to power, of enslaved people and the work that they've done, like lifting up these types of liberative stories. The repair work might really, look differently in the sense of like, how do we provide trauma support for folks in our congregation? Not how do we provide reparations for the injustice of enslavement. So I'm hoping that folks from different perspectives are going to enter into the story and into these narratives and into the responsibility differently. But that narrative story, that sort of origins, that liberative origin story can either call people to account or continue to sort of bring oppressed people's more and more sort of empowerment and seeing themselves there in the narrative.
Thank you, Jane, and thank you, Kate. I just want to mention here, too, that I was reading a book last week called After Method, Queer Grace, Conceptual Design and the Possibility of Theology by Hannah Ritchell. And this author uses design theory. They pick out design theory from architecture. Yours is more from advertising, but they use design theory from architecture to explore the comparison between the work of the Swiss theologian Karl Barth and the Argentine queer theologian Marcela Althaus Reed. It's quite an interesting and stretching analysis. I'm eager to know more about how design theory works in so many now of these queer and feminist theological works. So just want to underscore that for people who have not maybe been aware of how design theory is being used, various design theories, not just advertising, but also architecture. So thank you to you and thank you to Hannah for that work. Let's go on. I see first will be Levon and then Sylvia or whoever's using Sylvia's computer, and then Rosemary Ganley.
I see Janet Barron too.
Yeah, we've got some hands up, but they'll come next.
Cool.
These people have been waiting patiently in line. Janet.
Hi, Levon.
Hi. So I just wanted to first of all introduce myself. I'm Levon Limpus, and I'm in Dr. Commons' Social Justice and Sacred Texts. And as I'm listening and thinking how we could apply what we're learning from our coursework, I can really see this aspect of the social justice. But I'd be interested in hearing, how does this change affect this as sacred text? Could you comment on that, or do I need to clarify better my
No.
question?
I think I can comment on that. And it's a great question. So one of the things that's quite obvious is that archaeology, and there's broad consensus on this. There's a few outliers that really want to still see the conquest narrative in history, but those folks are ones that really take a literalist sort of perspective on the text. But so on one hand, the archaeology contradicts the biblical text, which can be challenging for folks when we're thinking about sacred texts and sacred authority and how we build that from understanding of texts and the ways in which faith traditions approach that. On the other hand, the archaeological evidence actually affirms and gives a lot of insight on other biblical texts. So think here, the book of Judges. A lot of biblical scholars and archaeologists say that the Highland settlements archaeology gives us a really affirmative understanding of the ways in which the Bible describes the Judges period. That if you read that text with an eye to the archaeological evidence, you're like, wow, this 150-year period, 200-year period where there was no leader, there was no king, really coincides with the archaeology. The second point is the Exodus narrative. One of the things about the early Hebrew Highland settlers was that they weren't a unified group. This wasn't just one sort of ethnic group going up into the Highlands. It was likely sort of a motley crew of diverse people coming in from all over the region with different cultural backgrounds, different sort of life practices. There could have been nomads or Bedouins, pastoral people, social dissidents, bandits, folks leaving these city-states, even people of upper sort of elite classes coming up into the Highlands. And so it was a big group of people. And their sort of religious practice and identity didn't happen for like 150 years later. So what held these groups together? Some folks from a cultural memory studies period say that it was likely some story of the Exodus, that it's a unifying myth that enabled all of the Highland settlers to sort of be like, you left Egypt, I left Egypt too. Oh, wow, here we are. We're here. This miraculous thing happened. We're watching as like these city-states are collapsing. There's drought, there's famine. You can sort of hear echoes of the plagues, and that there was something miraculous that happened that created a way out of no way, if you will. And so that the biblical texts, and specifically the story of Exodus, speaks to that time period in sort of a branded sort of way. I think the ways in which we narrate stories collectively through metaphor. And so on that hand, it can sort of deepen our appreciation of the text and its sacredness. I, for one, have a much deeper appreciation to these stories when I can think about these folks that were really struggling with these issues that we're facing, and then wrote their stories down and allowed it to shape them. So, but sort of the underlying question of biblical authority or sacred text, like how this story can sort of trouble that, it is troubling for folks that are still really holding on to the historicity of the text, the literalist, the inerrantness of the text. Archaeology challenges that, and scholars working in the field from that hermeneutical perspective do a lot of what I would say sort of scholarly gymnastics to try to make the two match. But the vast majority of biblical scholars and archaeologists that aren't having that textual commitment don't do that, and so are able to sort of let the text and the archaeology converge or, sort of diverge depending upon how the two kind of interact. So the book's not going to be for everybody. And I address that right up front. It could be a struggle for folks that have a certain biblical authority and hermeneutical approach to the text. But that's not where I'm coming from, and I think where a lot of folks are, but really still want to engage with the text and the traditions. And so I think it can help deepen your understanding of the Bible. If anything, it's made me appreciate it more. Thanks, Levon.
Kate. And I would just direct people to pages 132 and 133 in the text, where you have a very your own imaginative story vis-a-vis a liturgical text. And I think we'll put that in the notes if that's okay. That'll give people kind of a summary of what it is that you imagine could be really brought into the public arena in a straightforward and clear way. I'd also note that in the chat, someone asked me to put the title of the book I mentioned after method. So that's in there as well. And again, that will be in the notes. I'm going to ask Sylvia to ask the last question, and then I'm going to invite Rosemary and Janet to start the session right after the 2 o'clock hour. Just stay right with us, and we'll move right into that. But I want to close us officially so people who have to leave are able to make a couple of announcements, and then we'll continue the conversation. It's very rich indeed. Okay, go ahead, Sylvia. Unmute, please. You need to unmute. We can't hear you.
Okay.
There you go.
Okay, I'm Elizabeth Green, and with me from Italy, I'm a systematic theologian, and Silvia Zanconata is a biblical scholar. I would like to say 3 things. The first thing, Kate, thank you for a wonderful presentation. What I'm really impressed with is A, your enthusiasm, and B, the way you're holding things together. So biblical studies, archaeology, and practical theology. 2 questions. Are the Highland settlements discovered by archaeology? Do they have anything to do with the so-called high places that we find in the Bible? 1. And 2, are there any signs of worship, or what sort of worship has been found in the Highland settlements, and has any of that worship to do with the goddess or one of the goddesses? Thank you.
Great questions. Thank you so much. I could really nerd out on those 2 questions for a lot longer than I will. The first thing about the high places, yes, when the Bible starts talking about high places, and often it's talking about it in a negative way, that like sort of the Josianic reforms are going in and destroying all the high places, that yes, sort of what I would argue, indigenous sort of religious practices that were happening before that sort of 640 period on the timeline that I showed, goddess worship, the high places, which is sort of like another ancient Near East practice with like sacred trees, and that those sorts of like religious practices are evidenced throughout the period, from both the Highland settlements period onward, and then religious reforms 500 years later started to take those down. And so what you see, so that's answer 1. And there's tons of goddess figurines that have been discovered all throughout that, which is why some scholars talk about that Yahweh had his consort Asherah, and that Asherah is attested to in the archaeological record, even though she's sort of villainized in the biblical text, that wasn't the case. So I'll pause there, but yes, there's evidence of a lot of goddess worship, a lot of other things happening during these periods. And then for the worship in the Highland settlements, one of the things that scholars noted was that there was no evidence of Yahweh during this period. There was some slight carryover of the Baal religion, of the indigenous Canaanite religion. And so religion really wasn't a unifying factor. There's no real evidence that Yahweh the God was a prominent cultic figure at this 150-year period. The only evidence is indigenous Canaanite. And that's where people argue that there's something else happening here. It's not a new religious invention. It's more of a social sort of cultural genesis that's happening. And that whatever sort of drove the people to create a new cultural sort of imaginary wasn't the religion, that there was something else. And that's where I really mapped the Exodus story onto it, that there was this shared escape, miraculousness. The divine was probably part of that. But Yahwism doesn't show up until later periods in the ways that the Bible would have you think that it was very prominent from the beginning, but really no. That's a much later sort of recasting of the history. Mary, I'm wondering if I could make a quick announcement too before we get into Rosemary's.
Absolutely.
I put into the chat, I am running a course in April in conjunction with the Seekers Table. It'll be 3 sessions on Sundays I think starting April 14th from 7 to 8:30 Eastern time. And we'll be diving deeper into sort of the content of the book, but then also dreaming and working together to start to flesh out some of these sort of season of origins ideas. So if you know a community, a church, a pastor, someone that you think might be interested in these ideas, or yourself, there's the information on the course. And yeah, reach out to me if you have any questions. I'll drop my email in, or I think Mary has it, but
Thanks, Kate. And all of this information, just so people don't get crazy about trying to put it all on their computers at this point, we will put in the notes, and you'll get the
great.
notes shortly. So we'll
Thanks,
put
Mary.
the chat. Lisa always captures the chat, so we'll have that for the notes. And again, thanks to Lisa for IT help on this and all other things, social media, that allowed us to get such a good and diverse group together today. Rosemary Ganley, it'll be up to you. Move right along. Unmute and go right ahead.
Well, I just, I learned early about the hermeneutic of suspicion, I think from Elizabeth Schusser. And I think we've seen the fruits of that hermeneutic of suspicion that you have brought to your work, Kate. I'm very energized and very thankful to Water for bringing you to us. I'm an activist, and I appreciated your slide of Pope Francis in Canada last summer. That was a very meaningful encounter. And I was thinking about origin stories and how we need more exposure to more origin stories. We feminists are pretty critical about Genesis, either version. But I just wanted to mention to you that the Turtle Island, more of us progressives in coalitions in Canada working for justice are adopting that expression, and it comes from Indigenous communities. Yeah. They have a strong cultural presence now, and so we study the origin stories of others, not just our own. And you just gave us a marvelous example of what riches are there. And we can keep both. We can keep our interest in Hebrew Christian scriptures and our ongoing discoveries there, but also make some effort to learn others, especially the original people on the land. But Kate, I'm just very grateful for your work here today and your other work.
Thank you so much, Rosemary. I appreciate that. And I'm glad to hear about the work you all are doing in Canada. And I think you're really getting at that point, which as a designer, it always really moves me, is like, we need to use new metaphors. We need to use new language for how we're talking about stuff. And so starting to use Turtle Island as a reference, I'm assuming, for North America is a powerful practice, because those things are all sort of reshaping the ways that we think and the ways that we imagine our present. So thanks for sharing that. I'm excited to hear about that.
Thanks, Rosemary. And we always celebrate your birthday here at Water, and I know it's coming up later this month. So Janet Bourne, you're next, and then you'll be followed by Sheila Curran.
Okay, I'll make this fast. I was fascinated with your presentation, especially as you began to talk about the effect of technology developments in history through archaeology. And I wondered, in that time of climate change and the people who lived in the hills, is there any particular technology, metallurgical probably things, or other that developed that affected this time that they've discovered as they do their archaeological digs? And by the way, I'm in Ohio, and I'm familiar with Methesco and have known people who went there, so I'm glad you're in Ohio. But I come out of a science background and a UCC person, and I just am really interested in how the technology and the changes affected, because I think we're now in that kind of time now where AI is suddenly coming down and changing us And we could probably learn from looking at history and archaeology and technology. Thank you.
Thanks, Janet. Yeah, I touched briefly on it a little bit, but there were, I would say, 4 key things that you could talk about as new technologies that even enabled the Highland settlers to survive. And that is the chalk line cistern wells, and lining, sort of like digging out wells in bedrock and then lining them with chalk enabled it to preserve water for a long time without the water going bad. That was a new technology in this era. They did not invent it, but they leveraged it. And so that's new to the Iron Age, or right around that period. The second is the terraced agriculture. Again, we might take that for granted now, but it first sort of shows up in this time period where, you build like a backfill wall, fill it in with soil, and now you're able to have sort of a level place to grow stuff. Again, Highland settlers didn't invent that. They just used this new technology at scale across their region to be able to grow food. So those 2 they leveraged. The other ones are really considered democratizing technologies by a lot of folks. And they're democratizing because they enable people to have less dependence on the palace system. And so iron is one of the biggest ones here. People didn't have access to metal tools until the Iron Age, unless you were literally like the pharaoh, the elite classes, because bronze was really expensive to procure and to work with. And so it was limited to palace classes. So if you couldn't get a bronze plow or a bronze pick or anything to do sort of any kind of that work unless you were elite class. So ironworking was new to this time, and it enabled sort of off the grid folks like the Highland settlements to be able to buy or whatever trade for like iron tools. Itinerant blacksmiths would go around and create plows. Iron was readily accessible and it wasn't expensive to work with. And so that's a tool. There's evidence of iron tools showing up to do some of this hard agricultural labor. The second democratizing technology is the written alphabet. And so we don't think about that, but the Highland settlers were inventing the Hebrew alphabet. They weren't the only people at this time. The West Semitic languages all over beyond the Highland settlers were starting to create alphabet. This is a radical invention because written text up until this time period was limited to cuneiform or Egyptian hieroglyph. These languages were super complicated, really hard to learn. And the only people that could learn it were the elite classes, the the scribal schools ran by the palaces. And these languages were only used really for the administrative imperial state. So who owed the state what? How many things of wheat did the pharaoh give out? And how much money was due back? All of this was administrative language. The West Semitic people start to invent their alphabets all across the region. And so the Highland settlers start to create an alphabet of Hebrew. This is brand new. We see evidence of the Hebrew language being invented during the Highland settlements period. And this enables people to start to develop their own culture away from the imperial classes. And so this is radical. These people start to write down their stories. This is, and there's sort of a sacredness to text writing that we can't imagine in our own period. But I liken it to like sort of the rise of social media in the sense how we know it has all of its problems, but we think about it as democratizing in a certain way. Now everybody can post a YouTube video. It's not just NBC or CBS that has access. So there's a democratizing element to social media. The same is happening 1200 BCE, a democratizing element to like being able to write an alphabet and write your stories down. You can write your own law codes down. And so some biblical scholars argue that some of the Hebrew holiness codes are some of the oldest, and I think I can't point to where they're found in the Hebrew Bible, but are some of the oldest texts, and that these might have been early law codes. Like you hear like a Hebrew person can't keep a Hebrew slave for more than a few years, and the ideas of Jubilee and land back after a few years, that this comes out of this time period, which really tracks with that period. So those are the 4 key technological innovations that I think mirror in some ways our own technological innovations of being able to sort of live off grid, do things differently with solar power, social media. I mean, again, all of these sort of have a bad side too. They're not just one thing, but yeah. So those are, hopefully that answers your question.
Thank you, and thoroughly. Sheila Curran, you'd be next.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Katie, for a very interesting, and I'm very much into the biblical world and grapple very much with what you're trying to do. Because one, I think the way the narrative has been told, the linear way in which the narrative is told is always been dangerous, and therefore the other skills of hermeneutical skills of suspicion or ecological hermeneutics have tried to bring out some of the aspects which you highlight so clearly in your book. What I am concerned about is how you change a war narrative that is so dominant across our world today and justified by the means of religion, and particularly when we see it in those lands today, but also in other lands to the same extent in the continent of Africa or across.
Oh, yeah.
And how, despite different narratives and different, like I worry by what I see religion being used in your I'm in Ireland, in your political frame in the United States right now. It's not to say in this country it hasn't been used, but maybe not as strongly as a narrative, and how hard it is to pull it back from the very key things that you just illustrated. And then the other thing just to say is that another place you might look at Pope Francis's acknowledgement to indigenous peoples is what he did in Latin America, twice apologizing for the colonization of the Americas and the detrimental that was done, and when he held the Amazon Synod, and how that was then a juncture within Rome where people denied those people's expression of their religious liturgical ways by throwing some of their imagery or making out that their imagery was about something different than it was. It just might be another correlation to some of the ways in which you say reparation is trying to be done, not very well all the time, but at least there's an attempt. But just that war narrative and how to break it through, despite some of the really good work like yourself and others are doing to break it down. Thank you.
Sheila.
Thanks,
Those
Sheila.
statues went in the river, didn't they? As I recall.
They threw the image of the Pachamama, the three images, into the river, and he then, Pope Francis then, of course, apologized that people don't even respect what was being and mislabeled what they were doing as a pseudo kind of witch type ritual, which wasn't even what we're trying to do. And this was from very good Catholics and Christians that were around at that time.
Go ahead,
Yeah.
Kate. Thanks, Sheila.
Thanks, Sheila. I mean, thanks for telling me about the other Pope Francis stuff. I'm going to look into that because I didn't know it. And it's just like everywhere. I mean, you're right. Everywhere you look, you can pretty much see, especially if you're talking about sort of the impact of Western colonialism around the globe, just how these stories and the atrocities that have been done continue to do. I just got back from South Africa, so we're reading about the Afrikaners and how they leverage this narrative. It's just disturbing. And one of the things that has bothered me is that the progressive sort of approach to the conquest narrative or to really troubling biblical texts. Again, I'm not speaking for everyone, but all anecdotally, it's sort of like we preach against the text. We assume that we don't hold the text literally. So we can say, well, these texts are violent. They're not good. We don't think God really wanted that. That's not the God that we of flourishing. And that's really important sort of hermeneutical moves. But I don't think we can stop there precisely because of what you said, that these stories are still so active. And so my strategy in the book is we can't just say, we can't cut these stories out. That's not going to do anything. We can't just say, I don't think it's enough to just be like, well, we don't hold the Bible literally anymore. So let's just sort of move on. And when these come up in the lectionary, we'll preach against them. I want to be a more active change agent and say, let's do something strategic and let's lift up another story. Let's do something new, novel, that can generate excitement, that can get us practicing with a new story, that can really force us to look at these biblical texts and the authority and everything behind it, how it's shaping social imagination, how it's continuing to be used in really genocidal politics, and that the Christian stories and that they're actually really using these stories the way they're meant to be used. Like the Conquest story was really a story about trying to create power and othering people. And so it's actually working out quite well. I mean, way beyond what the originators of the story could have ever imagined in ancient Judah. Like these were traumatized people trying to deal with trauma. They did what they did, and that's, you know, we can understand that and have grace for that. But in the hands of imperial Christianity, these stories have just continued and continue to do harm, to the point that sometimes I liken the Bible as like a loaded gun in the back of pews. Like that's extreme. But when you see how these stories were leveraged, I think we need to take it as seriously as that. And so sort of all hands on deck, what can we do to try to counter these stories? And I don't think, and I think that's where I try to get creative and say, let's lift up another story. Let's invite people into this ancient world. It's exciting. It's fun. It's a new discovery. Let's center that in our churches. Let's center that in a progressive sort of narrative around what are we doing differently in church, or what are we doing in our faith communities differently?
Yeah. Thank you. I'm going to turn to Pamela Miller. You have a question or comment, Pamela, please go ahead. And then I think we might be finished. So go ahead, Pamela.
Yes, I had a question and I think it just got answered. And in my introduction to Hebrew Bible, the question was asked at the end. Now that we've known, see the Bible, the stories in a different light, how do we process it and still preach from the scriptures? How do we still hold that the Bible is sacred? But I think you just answered that in a bit. But the other thing I'd like to point out is you spoke about the Exodus. And in part of our Exodus class, when you learn, what came out for me is when they were given their codes, especially their dietary codes, laws, one thing that they were told, it is written as an exclusive group of people. They were all Israelites. Yet in it, they were told what you can have and what you cannot have. And some of the things that you cannot have, you can give it to the people who live among you. So if you're an exclusive group, how can you have, who are you going to give the excess to, or what you can't have to? So these are some sort of conflict and tensions like I find in the scriptures.
Yeah, Pamela, you're right. And I mean, I think there's so many of those tensions. Like even in the Conquest narrative, it's not one voice. It's like on one hand, God tells the Israelites to kill everybody. But then in the next verse, it's like, well, how do we get along with these people that are living over here? It's like, well, I thought everybody got killed. So now what? So it's like these tensions are all over the place. And I think sort of like my hope is through the book and through people that it will promote a greater biblical literacy. Where do these traditions come from? Why was there sort of an exclusiveness here, but maybe not here? Where are these different strands coming from in the biblical text? Not with a eye towards like dismissing the ways in which people authorize or feel towards their sacred texts, but actually inviting them into the richness of conversation that's there. And I think if anything, that can help enhance our understandings of the Bible from multiple different perspectives.
Thank you. Thanks, Pamela, for the question, and good luck with your own Hebrew Bible class this semester. I reiterate my thanks to you, Kate. I only wish that Norman Gottwald were around to be seeing the work that you're doing based on his work. And I remember him from many years ago in Berkeley, a really important predecessor of yours, and obviously someone whose work you have, on whose shoulders you stand, as it were, in terms of this kind of work. So I only regret that he's not here to see what you're doing with it, because I think to bring a feminist and queer perspective would have been educational for him as well, and he would have thought so too. On behalf of all of us, I say thank you so much and all good wishes, and we'll be in touch with you shortly about getting your notes, and whatever you can share that we can put in the notes, people will use. So thanks, Kate.
Thanks so much, Mary. It's been great. You guys are awesome.